Very good morning to our audience in Asia, and very good evening to our audience in the United States of America. Uh, the Asian Vision Institute, together with the Asia Foundation, have a great honor to host this event to examine the U.S. Southeast Asia relation under the Joe Biden administrations. And we have great honors to have our panelists from the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, Mr. Alexander Feldman, Mr. John Brandon from the Asia Foundation, and Dr. Len Tirut from the Asian Vision Institute, but now he's based in Canberra. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. So Mr. John Brandon is the Senior Director of the Asia Foundation. He's the specialist on Southeast Asia, in particular with the focus on Thailand and Myanmar. So he's been in Thailand for many years for research, and he's been in Southeast Asia for many times for different events and different projects. So his knowledge of Southeast Asia very deep and wide. And next we have Mr. Alexander Feldman. He's the chairman, president, and CEO of the U.S. ASEAN Business Councils. He used to serve in the U.S. administration, especially during the George W. Bush administration. So he has kind of a very deep business and also political experiences in relation to ASEAN and U.S. ASEAN relations. Last but not least, we have Dr. Len Tirut. He is the director of the Mekong Center for Strategic Study at the Asian Vision Institute. He holds PhD in political and international study from the University of New South Wales. So the objectives of our webinar today, we will discuss the key findings of the recent report published by the Asia Foundation. The title is Urgent Issues in U.S. Southeast Asian Relations for 2021. And Mr. John Brandon will elaborate more on the background and the key findings, which is very interesting. I would encourage our audience to read this report. So there are three main key findings and proposal here that I would like to highlight, and Mr. John Brandon and Alex can elaborate further on different pillars of U.S.-ASEAN relations. So first, the U.S. should recognize that Southeast Asia and ASEAN for its own importance, not just as a piece of a kind of chessboard of the U.S.-China competitions. That is very interesting because Southeast Asian countries are not interested in taking sides. I don't think it's a wise strategy for any major power, including the US or China, to force Southeast Asian country to take sides. So that perhaps is unrealistic and impossible. Second point, the US should forge a new initiative to promote secure, resilient supply chains. So in this regards, trade, investment, infrastructure development, and so on. So that, and also digital trade that the US is embarking on recently with regards to its relation with ASEAN, the digital connectivity. So that would be interesting because supply chains here perhaps need to move beyond the traditional understanding of supply chains, need to be more digital kind of spectrum as well. Third point here is the US should negotiate agreements with ASEAN and try to promote this kind of comprehensive kind of partnership with ASEAN when it comes to digital trade and digital standards and cybersecurity included. So that would be interesting area of cooperation moving forward between the US and Southeast Asia. Without further ado, I would like to first invite Mr. John Brandon from the Asia Foundation to share with us the background as well as the finding of the report and his perspective on the political security dimension of the U.S.-ASEAN, U.S.-Southeast Asia relation. Mr. John, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung Bunarit, and also Leng Tearith, and everyone at the Asian Vision Institute for organizing and hosting this webinar today. Until recently, we had an administration that questioned longstanding assumptions about the global political order and had taken actions that represented unprecedented departures from established U.S. foreign policy positions. The most notable actions were the U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Paris Agreement on climate change very on in President Trump's administration. And I think during this time, many Southeast Asians, as well as Asians in general, responded to Trump administration policies with a mix of relief, approval, confusion, and concern. And I think there was a time where people thought, was the United States going to withdraw from the region? The U.S. has not withdrawn, and but it had not been engaged as much recently, as evidenced by the low U.S. representation at the U.S. Asean and East Asia summits in 2019 and 2020. But whether the U.S. paid greater or lesser attention to the region, I think the one durable truth that has always been consistent is that Southeast Asia remains a vast, diverse, complex region full of conflicting trends and differing interpretations. The U.S. should recognize, as you mentioned, Dr. Bunarit, Southeast Asia and ASEAN for its own importance outside of great power rivalries. Southeast Asia is important. Collectively, it has the third largest workforce and the fifth largest economy in the world, with a combined GDP of about $3.1 trillion. If you look back just 20 years, the combined GDP of ASEAN nations was 700 billion. So the region has quadrupled. It's more than quadrupled its GDP just in the last 20 years. A very impressive feat. America is ASEAN's fourth largest export market, and in 2019, ASEAN became China's largest trading partner, surpassing both the United States and the European Union. Southeast Asia's sea lanes are located at the center of the world's strongest economic growth area and is a critical hub for global trade. Alex will be talking more about this, but the U.S. has also two treaty allies in Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Thailand, a close strategic partnership with Singapore, and a growing range of security cooperation programs, most notably with Vietnam. And given Southeast Asia's strategic importance, it's imperative for the U.S. to engage with Southeast Asia and ASEAN on its own merits and in a reliable, consistent manner. The Asia Foundation's Task Force report, Urgent Issues in U.S.-Southeast Asia Relations for 2021, identified what the task force believed to be the greatest challenges and opportunities in U.S.-Southeast Asia relations for the next 12 to 18 months, that time beginning with the inauguration of President Biden on January 20th of this year. And not only for this report was meant not just for the administration, but also for the Congress as well. We purposely decided not to give recommendations, but instead provided policy options for U.S. government officials to consider. The members of the task force were 9 Washington, D.C.-based Southeast Asia specialists who are scholars, analysts, practitioners who work for think tanks, NGOs, business associations, and the private sector. If you combined all of our experience amongst the 9 people, we would probably have several hundreds of, at least probably a few hundred years of experience with the region. Everyone offered their analytical expertise and broad experience with Southeast Asian countries, and everyone participated in their own personal capacities, and the views expressed are their own and aren't necessarily those of the Asia Foundation or any other institutions. The report was written in late December 2020, before the storming of the US Capitol and before President Biden was inaugurated. So we wanted this, no matter who won, we wanted this to serve as a blueprint for the administration to be able to follow as they try to become better engaged with Southeast Asia and with ASEAN. I'm very pleased to be able to speak with my friend Alex Feldman to present this report today. I'll spend the rest of my time about security issues and climate change, where Alex will speak about issues important to U.S. trade and economic policy, as well as infrastructure issues in the region. Since President Biden has come into office, he is primarily focused on domestic issues, and very understandably, he's come into office during a time of crisis. The pandemic, first and foremost, he's trying to address the pandemic and trying to get all Americans vaccinated. The second is the economic recovery needed to recover from this pandemic, as evidenced by the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that was passed not too long ago. And he's just introduced a new bill, a $2 trillion bill to improve American infrastructure, which also means to help improve American economic competitiveness. And three, to bridge racial and social divisions in our country, which have run very deep, particularly in the last couple of years. But external factors can't be put on the back burner for long. The Biden administration's policy is still a work in progress, but it's clearly in sharp contrast to the Trump administration. The Biden administration is trying to reassert U.S. leadership in the world and is placing a high priority to demonstrating its commitment to alliances in Asia and Europe. Secretary of State Tony Blinken's calls to the foreign minister of Thailand and the Philippines the day after he was sworn in demonstrates that alliances and bilateral relations have a piece in President Biden's diplomatic toolbox. But at the same time, multilateralism will likely prove to be more widely and publicly used tactic. And this should translate into greater American attention to ASEAN. A couple of positive steps since he has come into office is that the U.S. did rejoin the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and is participating in the UN's Human Rights Commission. I believe you'll see greater and higher attention to ASEAN by President Biden and his diplomatic and security teams. What is also needed is greater attention by Biden's economic team. I know Alex will speak more to this issue, but a number of administrations, both Democratic and Republican over the decades, U.S. economic policy has been lagging in comparison to security policy. As for security policy, we're all aware that Southeast Asia is on the front lines of Sino-U.S. competition. And this will probably be the case for the foreseeable future, even if we don't think it should be a piece on the chessboard. The region possesses a complicated mix of non-security issues that require American attention. These issues are maritime crime, natural disasters, and the threat of terrorism, particularly by foreign fighters returning from the Middle East. But over the next 12 to 18 months, the task force felt that there were more immediate or urgent issues that challenge U.S. security interest in the region. In the South China Sea, China's completion of artificial island bases in the Spratly Islands has radically upended the status quo in the South China Sea. Since 2017, Beijing has steadily employed naval, Coast Guard, and fishing fleets that serve as militias to the islands in unprecedented numbers. And Southeast Asia's fishing fleets are now being outcompeted by China's fleets not far from their shores. If this trend continues, fish stocks, which are already pushed to the limit, will collapse. Southeast Asian states will be forced to abandon offshore energy exploration as no commercial actor will accept the risk of operating in the South China Sea. The US and a few select navies will sail through these waters from time to time, citing freedom of navigation. But will this change the current status quo? The policy option that the task force offered was that is for the U.S. to build better coalitions to impose costs on Beijing for possible bad behavior in the South China Sea. If the U.S. hopes to impose costs effectively, it will need a way to bring European, Indian, and other external players along. As for alliances, U.S. alliances with Thailand and the Philippines have been challenged. For Thailand, I think it's been an enemy-depraved alliance since the end of the Vietnam War. Bangkok is comfortable balancing its power relations, but the U.S.-Philippine alliance differs from the U.S.-Thai alliance, as the U.S. cannot afford to show that strain, to allow that strain to move towards a rupture. The Philippines occupies critical geography, and there could be no successful deterrent strategy against Beijing in the South China Sea without American access to Philippine bases. Without these bases, the US would be forced to operate from Okinawa and Guam, too far from the theater to be credible. President Duterte's intention to terminate US-Philippines Visiting Forces Agreement has been suspended until this summer, which is basically an invitation for the Biden administration to put US-Philippine relations on a stronger footing. We hope that that will indeed be the case. Another policy option that we recommended related to the Philippines is that the Visiting Forces Agreement could be terminated before President Duterte leaves office. And there's no guarantee that for the US that security cooperation for the next administration would fare better. Abrogating the formal treaty security agreements would violate Manila's own obligations under the Mutual Defense Treaty and present Washington with an excuse to back off its own defense commitments. But this would come at major strategic cost. Maintaining access would require difficult compromises, including financial inducements for Manila, at least until 2022. Another policy option we offered was that the US should enter into a serious dialogue with Thailand on the basis of a 21st century alliance. Political instability in Thailand, ranging from military coups to urban warfare between political factions, has negatively affected the security relationship between both countries over the past 2 decades. Washington is also more lavish in its praise of Singapore and Vietnam than their traditional allies in Southeast Asia. As I mentioned a moment ago, this is an enemy-depraved alliance where there's a growing gap between Washington and Bangkok and threat perceptions in the region. Would this threat perception between both nations narrow or change if China became more assertive in the South China Sea, particularly if it was able to consider a strategic outpost in the Gulf of Thailand? Thailand is also concerned about Beijing's water management of the upper Mekong and negative repercussions they could have for millions of farmers and fishermen in Thailand, but also Cambodia, as well as elsewhere in the Mekong subregion. But as I said, China is a very important trading partner for Thailand and for virtually all countries of ASEAN. And it's a very different world. And China has played a very strong impetus in the growth of the region in general, and that's not lost on Thais and other policymakers throughout ASEAN. Another policy option we suggested was the U.S. should nurture a security relationship with Vietnam, but to continue to take this slowly and keep expectations in check. While the US and Vietnam share a perception of China as a threat, the two sides have divergent political values, and the number of Vietnamese elites remain distrustful of long-term US intentions. Human rights in Vietnam will be an irritant in the relationship, but strengthening the security relationship makes good strategic sense for both sides. But the relationship will not progress as fast or as far as some in Washington or in Hanoi might think, and any attempts to push the relationship is bound to backfire. Let me turn to climate change. Southeast Asia is home to more than 655 million people and is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. The top 6 countries affected by the steady rise of sea levels are all in Asia, and 3 are in Southeast Asia: Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. China may produce more mismanaged plastic waste per year than any country in the world, but ASEAN countries collectively produce even more. Secretary Blinken characterized US-China relations as the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. But for Southeast Asia, the rise of the ocean may prove to be the defining geostrategic event of this century. Climate change is wreaking havoc across Southeast Asia, from flooding, drought, and severe typhoons to heat waves, water scarcity, and crop-threatening salinization of the Great Irrawaddy and Mekong River deltas. Without urgent action, led by the 2 largest emitters of greenhouse gases, China and the United States, climate change will impose terrible costs across Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific more broadly. In any event, Southeast Asian nations will need to adopt mitigation strategies even as they join global efforts to find a more sustainable economic development model. Dikes and seawalls, beach nourishment, and the creation of mangrove forest and wetlands, and prudent urban planning can all help the impact of rising seas. But flood defenses are not cheap. Other forms of adaptation, such as the planting of salt-resistant strains of rice developed by the International Rice Institute, can also reduce the economic impact of sea level rise and help to safeguard the region's food supply. We came up with three policy options under climate change. One policy option was to invest in clean energy. All 10 members of ASEAN signed the Paris Agreement, but the region's reliance on coal will doom their efforts to meet their Paris emissions targets. Coal is popular because it's abundant and cheap, but it's also subsidized by developed countries that export thermal powers, in the case of Japan, or coal itself, in the case of the United States, to energy-hungry nations. There is encouraging news, however. Malaysia and Thailand are manufacturing solar panels with the help of Chinese investors seeking to circumvent anti-dumping duties imposed by the European Union and the United States. The US should consider shifting decisively away from coal-fired plants at both home and abroad and work to convince Japan and other allies to do the same, investing instead in clean energy projects, solar, wind, tidal, and geothermal, that would reduce Southeast Asia's reliance on coal. The US could offer incentives as tax breaks, duty-free imports, preferential loans, and easier access to financing to boost investments in renewables. More ambitiously, the US might consider building global support for a regional energy development scheme on the scale of the Marshall Plan to make clean power plants to a regional smart grid for Southeast Asia's megacities. It's also, we laid out a policy option in the effort to protect fragile forests. Rapid deforestation across Southeast Asia is another major source of greenhouse gases. A variety of techniques have been found to reduce this destruction: debt for nature swaps, creating national parks, reforestation, and ecotourism. But corruption, weak governance, and a profit motive continue to drive deforestation. To turn this tide, Southeast Asia needs to develop a consensus in favor of sustainable development. If adequately resourced under the US Mekong River Partnership, environmental protection strategies could perhaps be translated into policy blueprints, implemented in partnership with international organizations such as the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Third policy option was to invest in good governance. The US, has, given its own history, has experienced that there are significant political and practical difficulties associated with shifting away from fossil fuels. Pipelines, public land use, offshore drilling are issues fraught with opportunities for special interest that can prevail over the interest of the average citizen. In Southeast Asia, such pressures are even more acute, and the remedies, transparency, a vibrant free press, strong civil society organizations are often in short supply. Helping to strengthen governance in the region will require both professionalization of civil services and investments in NGOs, the media, and civil society. Here, the US can play a major role through training and anti-corruption programs with law enforcement and reaching out to civil society groups to bolster their capacity to promote clean energy and sustainable development strategy. This plays to the US strength: soft power investment in human capital. Investment in human capital are rather inexpensive, and they can pay dividends in the decades to come. Let me conclude by saying that if 2020 has taught us anything, the connection between global health and international relations are clear today as never before, as the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the responsibility of all nations to treat disease in a way that safeguards their neighbors as well as their own population. Southeast Asia has been contending with infectious diseases for decades, from HIV/AIDS, SARS, the H1N1 virus, to malaria, dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis, and now the COVID-19 coronavirus. President Biden saying the day after his inaugural that the US would join COVAX after President Trump spurning membership is positive for both the US and the world. The US has already committed $2 billion out of a total planned $4 billion to COVAX, making the US the single largest contributor to the international response to COVID-19. I know Indonesia, the Philippines, and Cambodia have received vaccines through COVAX. Hopefully these vaccines will be distributed efficiently and effectively. And so let me leave it there and turn it over to Alex, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I want to thank Asia Vision Institute and Dr. Chang Varnith and Dr. Lang Terith as well for being with us and hosting us today. And I want to thank John Brandon and the Asia Foundation for leading and putting together this important report. I'm going to focus, as John said, on the economics, trade, and infrastructure side of the equation. And before I get started, I hope that everyone watching is in good health, and I wish you good health and hopefully a quick recovery from COVID economically and from a health perspective. Again, my name is Alex Feldman. I'm the chairman, president, and CEO of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. The U.S. ASEAN Business Council was founded in 1984 to help U.S. business grow in Southeast Asia, as well as to promote opportunities in ASEAN across the United States. We're proud to be the only American organization that's formally recognized in the ASEAN Charter. And today we represent more than 160 of the largest American businesses with long-standing ties to the region through 9 offices, including 7 in Southeast Asia. Turning to trade and economics. Today, economic relations remain a key component of ASEAN's relationship with the United States. As John mentioned, ASEAN is the United States' 4th largest export market, behind only Canada, Mexico, our 2 neighbors, and China. It's also the #1 destination of American foreign direct investment in the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN received over $329 billion in foreign direct investment from the United States. This is more than the American companies have directed to China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined. Let me say that again, because I think it's an important fact. The U.S. has invested more in Southeast Asia from the private sector point of view than it has in China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined. It's a pretty big statement from American business on where we think the value is, and this is only growing. However, despite the private sector's focus on Southeast Asia, economic relations are considered the weakest link in the U.S.-ASEAN relationship. And we all know that in ASEAN, trade is strategy. The U.S. has 1 FTA in ASEAN with Singapore and few other trade-related agreements with other member states of ASEAN. However, U.S. competitors have charged forward with trade deals in ASEAN. The recently signed Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, brings together, as all of you know, 15 Asian nations to create the world's largest trading bloc. RCEP signatories include China and all 10 members of ASEAN, as well as Japan, Korea, Australia. Together, they represent almost 30% of the global GDP and 1/3 of the world's population. The EU has concluded bilateral FTAs with Vietnam and Singapore, and is in the process of trying to conclude an FTA with Indonesia this year. There have also been talks about an EU-ASEAN FTA in the future. Canada, our neighbor to the north, and ASEAN have announced their intention to negotiate an FTA in 2021. And of course, there's TPP minus the United States, or CPTPP, the 11 countries, which include Australia, Japan, Canada, and Mexico, as well as 4 members of ASEAN. But the Philippines, in the last couple of weeks, has indicated that they will want to seek to join CPTPP. And at various points in time, Thailand and Indonesia have also indicated the same thing. So the Biden administration is coming from a deficit in regards to trade agreements. And I'll get to a solution that we proposed in a minute, but the Biden administration really needs to recognize ASEAN's both potential and its current viability as an economic powerhouse. As all of you know, listening to this broadcast, ASEAN people are its strongest foundation. ASEAN has the 3rd largest population in the world. It comprises, as you know, of 650 million people, 60% of which are under the age of 35 years old. It also represents the 3rd largest labor force in the world. And if you just look at a couple key demographics, young people or women, both of those demographics on their own outnumber the total population of the United States. So just on those numbers, it makes sense. But then if you look at the middle class, it even makes more sense. So the middle class is expected to double in size from 135 million people today, or 24% of ASEAN's population, to 334 million people, or 51% of the population by 2030. That's a huge market for American business, but for all business, ASEAN and those from around the world. And that's why you're seeing the EU and China, Japan, Korea, Australia focusing on ASEAN. The favorable demographics, of course, underpin the booming economy. It's the 5th largest economy in the world today. Some predict it will be 4th in the not too distant future. But even today, it's the 3rd largest in Asia, behind only China and Japan. The world's, depending on how you do it, top 2 of the top 3 economies in the world. And ASEAN, I think, even with COVID, is going to be predicted to grow significantly at a rate of approximately 5 to 5.5% a year into the next several decades. Obviously, there's a pause in 2020 and a pause in 2021 to get to that rate, but you're going to see economic recovery in ASEAN move faster than most parts of the world in 2021. The Biden administration intends to establish the United States once again as a key champion of global rules-based approach to trade. Already, USTR Catherine Tai has begun re-engaging the WTO and G7 trade ministers. And even last week, she met in Washington with Indonesia Trade Minister Muhammad Lutfi. And this week, she had a call with Vietnam's Minister of Industry and Trade, Tran Tuan An, to discuss how the United States and Vietnam and Indonesia might move forward on trade in the short term. The U.S. commitment to transparency and good governance offers favorable alternative to major competitors. However, the United States has to take concrete actions to reestablish trust with our allies and friends throughout Southeast Asia. One way to do this is by establishing an annual U.S.-ASEAN Economic Forum, one of our recommendations to the Biden administration. Convening a U.S.-ASEAN economic ministers alongside a leader summit attended and hosted, I hope, by President Biden would demonstrate the U.S. commitment to the region. High-level cabinet officials from the United States, including the USTR, the Commerce Secretary, and the CEO of the Development Finance Corporation, could meet with their ASEAN counterparts to collaborate on economic issues. This would clearly signal that the United States seeks to upgrade its economic relations with ASEAN to match the level of engagement on defense and security issues that John described. New trade agreements would demonstrate long-term economic commitment to the region. This could include creating a refocused and elevated U.S.-ASEAN Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA, as we like to call it, work plan to deepen economic linkages and jointly shape the regional trade rules. Again, this is something that exists currently, TIFA, but we were suggesting in our report that we should upgrade the TIFA and really tackle much more serious issues than it's been able to tackle to date. Unfortunately, from my point of view, U.S. domestic priorities make it unlikely that the Biden administration will be able to ratify a fully fledged regional trade agreement within the first 2 years of his administration, which essentially means that CPTPP or rejoining TPP are off the table for the short term, the first 2 years. However, there is a road forward, and the digital sector is a key segment of the economy for the U.S. and for ASEAN to collaborate on. The digital economy itself is increasingly morphing into the overall economy, a trend that has accelerated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have all seen how the digital sector has driven ASEAN's economy. A recent study by Bain, Google, one of our members, and Temasek projects that ASEAN's digital economy will triple from $100 billion in 2019 to over $300 billion in 2025. And I'll go one step further and I'll say we will hit 300 billion before 2025. So come back to me in a couple of years and we'll see if I'm right. But this is because ASEAN is young and tech savvy. With 914 million active mobile connections, which is almost 1.5 times ASEAN's population. ASEAN is the world's fastest growing internet market. E-commerce in ASEAN has surged during the COVID-19 moment. A recent study by Facebook and Bain found that Southeast Asia would be home to 310 million internet consumers by the end of this year. That number was previously forecasted for 2025. So ASEAN's internet economy is just booming and growing, and people are getting online and contracting business online. And America's competitive advantage in technology and innovation, I think, is unquestioned. The U.S. can and should execute a digital economy agreement with key partners in Southeast Asia, starting with Singapore. Borrowing from existing trade deals such as the USMCA and the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, the two negotiating teams should be able to be 90% done before they even sit down at the negotiating table. So I think the key to this digital trade agreement, or digital economy agreement, as Singapore calls it, is the fact that it can be done quickly. The United States can get back at the table. And as far as my reading of the tea leaves, these agreements do not have to be ratified by the United States Congress, which would make it something that the Biden administration would be willing to do and should, in fact, do as soon as possible. And once the Singapore agreement is done, we hope to open it up to any interested party in ASEAN and beyond in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S., John mentioned this as well, the U.S. can also forge a supply chain initiative aimed at promoting secure and resilient U.S.-ASEAN supply chains. ASEAN is already an important U.S. trading partner for both intermediate and finished goods. A significance likely to grow as many U.S. companies seek to diversify or relocate entirely from China. The U.S. and other global actors should seek to cooperate on WTO reform as well. This is one of our other recommendations. WTO rules and procedures need to be updated to include the digital economy, among other things. And major stakeholders such as ASEAN need a seat at the table. ASEAN countries can help build support for initiatives among other emerging economies. Now I want to turn to infrastructure, the last section. ASEAN has tremendous infrastructure needs, as everyone listening knows. And it cannot fund the infrastructure it has on the books through purely domestic financing or government spending alone. The region's infrastructure gap, or total infrastructure investment needed to supplement domestic resources, is $2.8 trillion for the period from 2016 to 2030, according to the Asia Development Bank. Infrastructure development is a major priority for ASEAN governments. It's also, as John said, a major priority for the US government here in the United States as well. From a geopolitical perspective, infrastructure investment plays a large role in how China and the US are perceived in ASEAN. Infrastructure is a long-term fixture in countries, and from a public diplomacy viewpoint, which I used to work on in the US government, it is a huge bonus for any country that can help build critical infrastructure. China realizes this and is ASEAN's leading infrastructure development partner. China has established its Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative to finance these projects. And unfortunately, I don't have more recent statistics, but as of 2018, China had already invested over $739 billion US dollars in ASEAN through the BRI, according to Oxford Economics and CARI, the Malaysian think tank. Beijing-based Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB as we know it, has invested $225 billion in the 6 largest economies of ASEAN through 2019. The Chinese infrastructure investment in ASEAN far outpaces the American infrastructure investment. From 2008 to 2016, Chinese commitments, I underscore commitments, were 40 times the size of the US investments, according to the Brookings think tank in Washington. Why is this? And what can we do about it? Well, it's really because the ASEAN's regional priorities do not match the U.S. strengths. U.S. companies are not well placed to provide turnkey solutions, and our companies are not particularly interested in providing the turnkey solutions that Chinese, Japanese, Koreans are very able to provide. Therefore, it's harder for us as Americans to get a foothold in the space because we usually provide components of infrastructure projects, not the complete projects themselves. Because of the geopolitical implications, the United States, though, should improve its engagement with ASEAN in infrastructure, but we need to do it smartly. The US should not compete with China on infrastructure development on a dollar for dollar or renminbi for renminbi basis. The US should not focus on the hard infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, and ports, where China has a significant advantage and has done so well. Instead, the United States should underwrite infrastructure projects that play to our strengths. Historically, this includes energy infrastructure, but the United States also has strong soft infrastructure skills and resources. As such, digital infrastructure, health infrastructure, and skills building education infrastructure are key to a US pathway forward. These areas are not as resource or time intensive, but have a huge impact in themselves, and will allow us to play an important and impactful role in ASEAN's development. The American private sector will work closely with our institutions such as the Asia Development Bank and US government agencies, including the Development Finance Corporation and its partner institutions, which provide vehicles for infrastructure financing. If projects are bankable, then the private sector of the United States will also want to step in. And we had six crucial ideas to put forward in this regard. First, the U.S. should leverage its existing resources, as I talked about, on a limited number of high value and high profile projects. These will illustrate the benefits of the U.S. approaches to projects, including the use of local labor, better life cycle costs, and supporting infrastructure development in ASEAN in a transparent manner. Secondly, we want to promote bankable projects, including by helping ASEAN nations build capacity to design and market these projects, not only to the United States, but globally. Third, we want to emphasize tools and training through ongoing U.S. programs, including the BUILD Act, which we think should be amended as our fourth recommendation, to increase the financing infrastructure projects which give ASEAN nations more flexible alternatives to partnering with China and others. And fifth, we think we should be collaborating with allies and partners to offer alternatives to projects from China, including ensuring that we're part of coalitions and allow us to do what we do best, which is provide the component parts of infrastructure projects, often key component parts like gas turbines for electricity plants, to our partners in Southeast Asia, and ensure that we increase our partnership with our friends in Asia, including Japan, Korea, and Australia. And lastly, we believe it would be helpful to everyone to hold a high-level U.S. Southeast Asia infrastructure development event on an annual or biannual basis. I'll stop there, and hopefully I've given you a good overview of what we were thinking when it comes to economics, trade, and infrastructure. I thank you for your time today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. John Brandon and Mr. Alexander Feldman, for very comprehensive kind of examination of the U.S. Southeast Asia relations and the future outlook of the relationship. I turn to Dr. Lencherit as a discussant. You can either raise comment or question to our distinguished panelists. Dr. Lencherit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van der Chien, for handing over the floor to me. And at the same time, I would also like to thank Mr. John Brandon and Mr. Alexander Feldman for a very comprehensive and interesting report on the urgent issue in the U.S. ASEAN relation. I myself find very impressive, report, interesting report. Yeah. In my opinion, I do agree with all of you that the U.S. has found its ways to engage more and more with Southeast Asian countries, and even Southeast Asian countries themselves also, find a very, try their best to engage the U.S. too, because they know that the U.S. is a very important player in the region, both, in the security sector as well as in the economic sectors. Yeah. But at the same time, as I went through your report, I found a very, interesting point, but a little bit, I found a little bit a controversial point on the naval base about Americans, like concern about that Cambodian might, host, like Chinese base in the Ream as well as in the Kokong. And then I myself just, find a little bit of, we call here a little bit awkward. And if possible, I think, this kind, a report should be at least, how can I say, rectify. Yeah, and I think from the Cambodian point of view, I think that there is no point of hosting the foreign military base inside Cambodia, because that would provoke the other Southeast Asian countries, especially the neighboring Cambodias, Vietnam and Thailand. They become more resented, and Cambodia relation with those countries will become I don't think that will be good. Yeah, so I think that at this point in time, especially Cambodia, in my opinion, they want to improve their infrastructure as well. Like at least more or less, Alex already mentioned that infrastructure is very crucial for the developments of Southeast Asian states like Cambodia. Cambodia really need that, because we went through many years of civil war, and a lot of infrastructure projects in Cambodia were destroyed by the war. And this is the reason why Cambodia need a lot of help from both China and the United States. And I think the United States in this regard, like Alex already mentioned here, U.S. education, ICT, blah blah blah, all is very strength of the United States, and all of this Cambodia really need that from the U.S. So, and I really appreciate if United States can use all of this strength to engage Cambodia more, can help Cambodia more in this regard, and really appreciate that. But one side, I just would like to ask the both of you, to John and Alec, is there any way that the U.S. administration can engage the small states, especially Cambodia, in a more constructive way, and without, jeopardizing the national interests of those small states? And this is my question. Thank you to both of you once again for a very insightful and interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lê Tirret. Now I turn the floor to John and Alex, especially with regards to the interests of small states.
John, you're on mute.
My apologies. Sorry. Thank you both for your comments. I mean, in terms of engaging with small states, I think that's always probably a perennial problem with all small states, whether they're in Southeast Asia or whether they're in other parts of the world. How do you garner greater attention? In one sense, that's how ASEAN was able to, to include more of its members and to become a more cohesive region, and by trying to get greater attention, not just from the United States, but from other extra-regional powers, China, Japan, Australia, India, and others, the European Union, to be able to pay greater attention. And I think that's been the success of ASEAN, to be able to do that. How to be able to do that on an individual basis, I think probably varies depending on the country, depending on the U.S. history with that country, whether it's been good or whether there have been bumps in the road. And to be honest, there have been bumps in the road with the United States and Cambodia. I think I would be curious to hear what Alex would have to say in terms of what I think small countries would like more investment. They would like more trade. They would like to know how that could be facilitated. So I think that's probably I think among small countries, maybe their most important issue. To get to the point when you talked about Reem and Dara Sakor, we didn't take a position on what it was being used for. We speculated on the possibility because there's been a concern and reports in the United States that this was that this could be the possibility of a base, an airfield, or a naval, base that could have a presence. You talked about the infrastructure development, and that's fair enough. But the thing is that I think it maybe raised eyebrows in Washington that when at Dar Sakor Airport, that the runway was I think over 3,000 meters, and it's viewed as much longer than the airport in Phnom Penh, where you would think for commercial uses, where Dar Sakor is a bit further off the beaten path there. So that's that. I think more people to people having a better understanding of each side is always a good thing. So public diplomacy, that was considered more of a longer term issue, but I think still nonetheless important. So why don't I just stop there, and I'll turn it over to Alex for his thoughts about how maybe smaller states can engage with the United States economically.
Well, thank you. First of all, John, I thought you were going to go there, but you saved some for me, so that's great.
Yeah.
ASEAN, I think, is the key to engagement. Next year, Cambodia will be chair of ASEAN. That's a huge opportunity for bilateral as well as obviously the regional partnership with the United States. To see how that goes will be very important. I think that it also is a way for economic engagement. ASEAN really is the key to economic engagement, investment in Cambodia. Will be buoyed by stronger infrastructure connections between your neighbors. And I think there's a lot that can be done. I mean, obviously, His Excellency Prime Minister Hun Sen is someone that the U.S. ASEAN Business Council is very familiar with. He's very generous with his time for us. We want to see more investment from American companies. It has come. I've been coming to off and on to Cambodia since 1994, and I've seen the tremendous improvement in lifestyle and infrastructure and livelihoods of Cambodia. But I've also seen, even more recently than that, the investment of American companies, and especially in Cambodia's young people. And it's such a young population. There's tremendous opportunity for digitization. But I have to say that some of the recent moves on the internet gateway give pause to some of our members about how solid of a market for the digital economy Cambodia will be. So we want to continue to work with the government of Cambodia and talk with them and try and figure out what's in their best interest, but also what makes sense for business, and maybe have them consider that going forward. But we've had many discussions with the ministers in Cambodia over the years about how infrastructure connecting ASEAN can play a huge role. And we've also got something that I hope is close to fruition. I've been working on it for 12 years, but my colleagues at ConocoPhillips have been working on it for even longer, and that is to bring cheaper energy to Cambodia through the development of the overlapping claims with Thailand in the Gulf of Siam. And I'm told that maybe there's some opportunity that maybe things can move forward. Both the governments of Thailand and Cambodia are looking at that, because it is a way for Cambodia to attract more investment from the United States, not only in the specific elements of oil and gas development, but also more importantly to bring down the cost of electricity to the people of Cambodia, but also to the businesses that invest there. And that will make Cambodia more competitive. So I think ASEAN is really the key. And lucky for Cambodia, you're chair of ASEAN next year. So let's see what you can do. And obviously I'll be bringing this message to Prime Minister Hun Sen when I have the opportunity to see him next.
Thank you very much, John and Alex. We have several questions posted in the chat room. First from Mr. Chirvisna. So his question relating to the trust building or restoration of the U.S. economic role in this region, because the previous administration, very protectionist and transactional, withdrew from the TPP and so on. And you mentioned earlier that it may take another 2 years for Joe Biden administration to consider joining TPP. So that is the question. So second question from Jin Borin with regard to institutional kind of competition between the China Belt and Road Initiative and the U.S. Initiative. I think he also referred perhaps to the free and open Indo-Pacific. And what ASEAN should respond to these two initiatives. So two questions first. Maybe Alex can go first, and then John.
I'll take the first question. Yeah.
Sure. For the first question, maybe I would like to just maybe have the second question restated. I wasn't sure I caught the gist of it, but certainly on trust, I totally agree with that we need to get back in ASEAN in a meaningful way. And our two different recommendations to the Biden administration would help to do that. We need to get back in the trade negotiating game. We need to have an agreement that stands on its feet, that doesn't get held up in Congress. And that can be done in two ways. One, by elevating the TIFA, or the Trade Investment Framework Agreement, and having that take on more important roles with the region. Again, that's something that already exists. There's nothing that Congress needs to do on that. Just USTR needs to suggest to ASEAN that we revamp it. So I think that's an easy one. I think the other one is the sector-specific limited trade deals, which I suggested we start with the digital economy, since the digital economy is quickly morphing and touching all parts of the economy. There's a couple different ideas out there, but I think given the trust factor, I think the most important thing is to get that deal done quickly and efficiently. And as I said, Singapore and the US are very close to having a deal done. So if we can get that done and show that the US is back, show that we can be a reliable partner, and demonstrate that through an agreement that we then open up to the rest of ASEAN and the rest of the Indo-Pacific, I think that will help us build trust. But trust, as you all know, is something that takes a long time to build up, and as you saw in the last administration, can be torn apart in an instant. So it's not going to be easy, but the first step is to get back at the table and to establish ourselves as a trusted trade partner through either TIFA or through a digital trade agreement. So I'll stop there. John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that comment.
No, I think you've covered that. I'll take the second question. I was sort of struck. I read it, and there were a number of questions in there, but one of the questions was, well, how can the United States take back Asian countries from China? I was struck by that. I don't think the United States should take back Asian countries from China. I think my view is that I'm assuming that you're talking about Southeast Asian countries, but I think this applies even in Asia more broadly. I don't think there's any Southeast Asian country, no matter how large or small, that is going to accept an exclusive relationship with either China or the United States. It's not a zero-sum game. Southeast Asian countries through ASEAN have been very adroit in being able to hedge, balance, and bandwagon, and to be able to manage its relationships with extra-regional partners, particularly the United States and China. I think that's actually in ASEAN's political DNA. to do that. You've become rather accustomed to it after, particularly over the last little over 20 years now, since ASEAN grew from 5 to now 10. I think it's been difficult given the varying levels of countries' political and economic development. But nonetheless, I think ASEAN can take credit for doing this. You talk about the BRI. Well, as Alex pointed out, the ASEAN nations need infrastructure, and that the United States is not going to be building ports, bridges, railways, electric grids, things of that nature. But it does have the ability, as Alex mentioned, in terms of different segments, the digital, health, education. And I think that that's where the United States can be helpful. These can complement what China is doing, and China's can complement what the U.S. is doing. And the purpose of this is to basically see a viable political, economic, and socially dynamic Southeast Asia and ASEAN. I mean, I mentioned in my opening remarks, the collective GDP in 2000 of ASEAN was $700 billion. It's now about 3.1 trillion, more than quadruple the size. Think if all this infrastructure comes in, all of this economic development comes in, digitally, improving of health, environmental sustainability, better education. What is the potential that ASEAN has? It's potentially enormous. And so I don't think anyone's trying to take anyone from, any country from China or vice versa. At a minimum, we shouldn't. No one should try to do that.
And ASEAN won't let us. ASEAN doesn't want to choose, and it's not up to us. It's up to the countries of Southeast Asia to choose their partners.
So,
thank you. Next question, specifically concerning Cambodia-U.S. relation, and what are the key kind of proposals to advance a relation between the two countries, especially under Joe Biden administrations?
Well, I think that Joe Biden and his administration is still trying to grapple with approaching the region. I think approaching it in ASEAN in a comprehensive, integrated manner. In terms of what it's doing specifically with Cambodia, I think one positive thing right now is that Cambodia, actually, the United States has an ambassador in Phnom Penh. I think that's important. Not all ASEAN countries can
we have 6
make
empty spots right now.
6 empty spots, and does that include, Alex, the U.S. ambassador to ASEAN?
Yes, it does.
It does. Okay, so
we have not had a U.S. ambassador to ASEAN since 2019. Or sorry, right. Since 2016.
2016 or 17, yeah.
17.
But so I think that's useful. There are going to be irritants. All right, we've had them in the past. President Biden has talked about the importance of wanting to promote democracy. Sometimes that has not been appreciated in not just in Phnom Penh, but in other capitals at other times. I think the important thing is how you approach that, how you try to work in trying to achieve that. And so that's one. I think economically, you want a more robust economic relationship. What can the United States do to be able to foster trade, and also as well as and in turn development, economic development in that regard, and people-to-people ties. So it's one of the things is that there's a sizable Cambodian community in this country, and so how to be able to use that community maybe in helping to improve relations could be another way of looking at things.
And I just want to go back to the ASEAN chairmanship. The last time Cambodia was chair of ASEAN, a lot of the same players that are leading
Yeah,
the
that's
Biden
true.
administration were there. It did not go as well as it could have. And I think if the Cambodia-U.S. relationship could be improved by how Cambodia handles its chairmanship of ASEAN next year, and ideally balances the various powers, including the United States. So, I think that's important. But we've got,
And that's also a good
that
opportunity to put it back on a better footing.
it is, and Ambassador Murphy, the U.S. ambassador to Cambodia, is a seasoned diplomat who knows the region well. Was in the front office of EAP, or the East Asia Pacific Bureau, in the State Department, and also was in Thailand. So he could be a critical link to making this happen, and I think he's got the view that he'd like to do that. So I would love to see him be successful, and hopefully the rest of the Cambodian government can work with Ambassador Murphy and the team in Washington. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with John and Alex that in terms of people-to-people relation, I think Cambodian people view very positive toward Americans, because like if they choose between the American university and the other university in Asia, they would say, oh, American university is the best one, right? And this is not to mention about English language has been used as a medium, very popular language in Cambodia. Yeah, and also John also already mentioned about the Cambodian community in the United States. So I believe that all of this will become a very important bridge for the Cambodia and the US to get together. However, I have a very small concern that in terms of economic relation, a good relation should start from economics. For example, let's say Cambodia really needs infrastructure development, and this is something that perhaps the United States find difficult to offer to Cambodia. Like you already mentioned, that because you already have limitation in this area. So in this regard, I find that the United States should invest more in terms of like energy cooperation. Like you already mentioned that, but I want to see something more, because this is something that Cambodian people really want to see. Yeah, because that would improve the livelihood of Cambodians. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex and John. Yeah.
Thank you. We have many more questions. So first, I think in connection to energy infrastructure, energy sector investment. So that's a question of the future U.S. investment in this energy sector. Alex, your kind of crystal outlook of the U.S. investment and energy sector in Southeast Asia.
Well, I mean, in Southeast Asia or in Cambodia or both? So
Southeast Asia and Cambodia in particular, Southeast Asia in general, yes.
Okay, but look, we believe in investing in energy and infrastructure, and even although we probably aren't going to build full grids of electricity, our companies are interested in smart grids and how we can help ensure that electricity that is generated is used wisely, and in Cambodia and in Southeast Asia. So there's a big push. We have ASEAN, U.S. ASEAN Edge initiative that is from the Trump administration, but is likely to continue into the Biden administration, which looks at energy cooperation across the board. Obviously, the Biden administration is going to take a hard look at the types of energy cooperation that we're looking at. Coal will probably be not on the top of the list, but clean energy, natural gas will be. Obviously, the U.S. has had a glut of LNG or natural gas that we can turn into LNG. And that could help power Southeast Asia as well. And we've had talks with Vietnam and with Thailand and others about taking LNG from the United States. So there's a lot of cooperation that could happen and should happen. We haven't mentioned it yet, but on, I believe it's April 20th, President Biden has invited 40 leaders to join him virtually in a climate summit on Earth Day. And that will entail looking at how the major economies of the world, and there are 3 economies in Southeast Asia invited: Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore. How Southeast Asia manages its energy future. So there's a number of projects. The DFC, or the Development Finance Corporation, also has energy at the top of its list in terms of funding projects. So it's got to be a combined effort, but we've got tremendous assets. GE makes wind turbines for the world in Haiphong in Vietnam. So we've got a lot of stake in solar, in wind, in natural gas, of course, and we're increasingly interested in how geothermal energy, especially in places like Indonesia and the Philippines, may be better employed to generate electricity. John, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this area, on energy.
I think you've covered most of it. I think that in terms of energy, Southeast Asia has been both an energy producer, but also equally it's been a transit route of energy through the Malacca Straits and down into from the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and down through the Malacca Straits into the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And so Southeast Asia is critical, both, as I said, as a producer, but also as a transmitter of energy around the world.
And the digital economy will continue to increase the demands on the power grid, and so we will need to do that, especially if we go to electric cars and other things. We're going to need to produce more electricity, and we're going to need to find more resources, and we're going to need to do it in a cleaner manner.
Thank you for the audience information. AVI is part of the Jeffrey Sachs initiative on sustainable ASEAN, or ASEAN New Green Deal. So we will launch sometime this year. So that is something we're working on to promote sustainable development goal and clean and renewable energy. Very important topic for our regions, also in relation to climate change too. Next question relating to the role of ASEAN in the US FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific under Joe Biden. Is it any different from Trump administration when it comes to free and open Indo-Pacific, and what the US expect the role of ASEAN, or what ASEAN should do in this regard? So maybe John first, and then Alex.
Sure. In terms of the free and open Indo-Pacific region, it sort of took life in under the Trump administration, but a lot of it was with trying to, I think it kind of focused on pretty much the Indo-Pacific, focused mostly on China. And I think one of the shortcomings of the last administration's policy was that Southeast Asia and ASEAN became sort of subjected to sort of more overarching China-centric policy that the United States had. And as I said, it kind of went against the grain of what we were saying about ASEAN on its own merits, on its own terms, and the value that it possesses. I think ASEAN tried to have react to that in various ways, and their different countries have had their their policies towards it. I think what you'll see is from a Biden administration is where you are looking, yes, China is important, yes, India is important, the Quad is important, but how would that fit in larger Asian regional architecture would undoubtedly have to include ASEAN, because ASEAN is the linchpin of all Asian regional architecture. And so I think that that ASEAN will have a more pronounced role, and the U.S. will have a more pronounced interest in the region as a consequence.
So I'd just add on to that and say that, look, we haven't heard FOIP mentioned, at least I haven't in Washington since January 20th of this year. But, and the big but, that the Biden administration has clearly indicated that they will keep the Indo-Pacific focus. And they've done that by appointing Kirk Campbell as the Indo-Pacific coordinator, sort of ASEAN, Asian czar. I like to think he's the ASEAN czar, but he's not. He's the Indo-Pacific czar in the White House. He's the coordinator. He has 3 directorates of the NSC underneath him. He has East Asia, China, which has been broken out for the first time, and South Asia directorates under him. And as you know, he has stated very clearly that the Biden administration will approach ASEAN for ASEAN on ASEAN's terms, and that he will look to ASEAN to be an important region on its own without consideration of any larger geostrategic games, if you will. He also is the author of a book called The Pivot, but also the strategy of the Obama administration when he was Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, where he basically articulated and got the Obama administration to pivot back to Asia. And always, whether it's the free and open Indo-Pacific of the Trump administration, or the pivot of the Obama administration, or the new policies of the Biden administration, ASEAN has always been central to all of these frameworks. Central because we believe in ASEAN centrality, but also central because of its convening power to bring and geographic presence, but convening power to bring the powers of the Indo-Pacific together at the East Asia Summit. And that's the only place that all the powers, India, Russia, China, the United States, all meet. And then the Biden administration has already said that they will continue to embrace the East Asia Summit, as well as the ASEAN Summit, as well as the US ASEAN Summit. So I think that is a clear indication that maybe without the free and open part, but certainly with the spirit of that, the Biden administration will continue to focus on the Indo-Pacific with ASEAN at its heart.
Thank you.
If I
John,
if I could just add one quick thing, I think what would be really important if there's going to be a U.S. ASEAN summit and an East Asia summit, and I think Joe Biden will attend it. The question is whether it would be in person or whether it would be held virtually. I think either way, I think what would be important by the time that happens, if we can have an ambassador to ASEAN rather than a charge, and if we can have the other 5 embassies that don't have an ambassador there right now in various ASEAN countries, I think that would be very important. And I think it would just show, it would be a great illustration of the Biden administration's commitment to ASEAN, having those people in place by November this year.
And of course, we need Congress's support
always,
in that.
Right.
So that's always challenging, John. But we've got a great charge d'affaires in Indonesia. I just want to give a shout out to Melissa Brown, who is really running the show and the charge for America with ASEAN. She's great, but she could use a fully credentialed ambassador to work with.
Thank you. We have one more question, and maybe we spend the last few minutes to get your perspective on the Myanmar issue and Cambodian chairmanship of ASEAN next year. So question here relating to the different FOIP initiative, US, Japan, Australia, even Germany, India, even France have its own FOIP. So what does it mean? I mean, this different initiative and mechanism, can it be synergized?
Can it be synergized? I don't know. I think it sort of gets to Alex's point, is that, you know, the focus is going to be on the Indo-Pacific. Maybe the FO will be not as great attention paid to I mean, I think the could it be, I guess it's possible that it could be synergized, but I mean, that's an awful lot of different countries that have just been mentioned. So if all of these are going to be in sync, it could also create a little bit of room for havoc as well. And so and also, how would you synergize this? I mean, is it what, the economic policies, the security policies? I mean, it's be rather daunting, and it seems to add a layer of region of architecture that I'm not sure people were imagining at the moment.
I don't have anything to add further on that comment.
Thank you. So so entertain one more question. Cambodian chairmanship of ASEAN. What you expect Cambodia should do to enhance ASEAN-US relation when Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN? Maybe one or two proposals for the Cambodian chairmanship.
Alex, why don't you take that? Because I know the next one's Myanmar, and I'll go for that.
Okay, all right. Well, look, the biggest thing with ASEAN chairmanship is to balance all the different interests of ASEAN and its +6 partners and its East Asia summit partners, which the last would be include the U.S. You know, certainly one of the outcomes needs to be that that Cambodia needs to steer a path that will allow consensus and to find a way for ASEAN to move forward with one voice and advance its interests in the future. And there's going to be lots of challenges. Obviously, COVID-19 will still be an issue then. Certainly the economic recovery will still be an issue for many of the ASEAN countries. ASEAN moving forward together, the potential of ASEAN is boundless, but the opportunities can be constrained by infighting within ASEAN. So from my point of view, Cambodia needs to be a true leader and find a way forward, and not to be either perceived or in reality leaning towards any one partner or group of countries, but to really lead ASEAN as a whole. And if it does that, I think Cambodia will be in for a very successful ASEAN year, and I hope the Prime Minister will take that to heart. And happy to support. You know, happy to say the U.S. ASEAN Business Council would be glad to bring our resources and our ideas to the aid of the support of Cambodia's chairmanship year.
Thank you, John. With regards to Myanmar political crisis, unfolding political crisis, what do you think is the role of ASEAN and the ASEAN chair, because it may drag for many years to come, and Cambodia will be the chair next year, and how Cambodia should deal with the Myanmar political crisis?
I'm afraid you may be right in that it may drag on. It's a horrible situation. In fact, I think that it was. It seems like it was so counterproductive and pointless that the Myanmar military did this at a time when they controlled the 3 most important ministries. They had 25% of the seats in the parliament, and they more or less could serve as a check against the elected civilian government led by Aung San Suu Kyi and President Min Win. Right now, it seems that there's a slaughter going on. You know, hundreds of people are being killed. There's more talk that if there's a federalized army, and that the ethnic armed organizations, or some of the ethnic armed organizations, which are feeling that this might be an opportunity to reject the military and its actions, coupled with a large segment of the civilian population, particularly those in what they're calling Generation Z, if you could wind up having a civil war. And to me, this will be the biggest security crisis that ASEAN has faced in some time. Even when Cambodia was going through the time of the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia was not a member of ASEAN. ASEAN was sort of like a group of just 5 countries, with Thailand being a frontline state. Now you have all of these countries. You felt that there was some progress made over the last 10 years, and that seems to have all evaporated. What can Cambodia do? I think trying to work where you could. A lot of times ASEAN is described as one organization with multiple voices. I think chairman of ASEAN, whether it's Brunei now or Cambodia next year, or if it's other countries going in order, in alphabetical order as time progresses, I think that somehow you have to create some kind of unity in how you want to deal with Myanmar and the State Administrative Council, and to try to bring peace and security to the country. The question is whether Myanmar feels that it's enough. They might feel that if they just have a few friends, that would be enough. I heard them say that a lot in the 1990s, even before they joined ASEAN. They'd probably be looking more to Russia and to China, which I don't think is in ASEAN's interest. ASEAN has to step up its game somehow. 3 of your countries in ASEAN are major investors, Singapore being the largest, followed by Thailand, but then also Vietnam. And so how can you make your points politically, economically, and to be able to reach out, it's definitely a big step backwards. I don't want to see it go back decades. The question is how can you retain as much as possible the advances Myanmar has made over the last 10 years and to be able to move on. But it's a very daunting challenge, and the international community seems very divided by it right now. I'm sorry I can't be more positive. I'm sorry I'm not more optimistic.
Thank you, John. One last question to Alex with regard to the investments sector and digital education and the role of the United States in ASEAN.
Well, we've got a huge opportunity, and in terms of our investment, I think you're going to see more investment come into ASEAN. ASEAN is a destination, as I said, people try and rebalance from their investments in China, but also people are increasingly realizing that ASEAN, on its own merits, is a critical market and geographically well positioned to serve both South Asia and Northeast Asia. And therefore, I think you're going to see twin trends, both the investment coming down from China, but also green investment coming into ASEAN as people realize what we've known for a long time at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, that this region is the best in the world for American companies. And then in terms of American education and digital education, the USABC is stepping up our game. We have had for the last 9 years a program to help SMEs in Southeast Asia grow by having them learn from our multinational companies' experiences and get mentorship and other things from our large companies. We're going to expand that program. We're going to have a digital SME summit later this year. But we also have the official ASEAN SME Academy. And I'd invite all of your viewers to go there, because there are free courses from the likes of Google and Apple and UPS and FedEx to hone skills and upskill education for entrepreneurs and SMEs across ASEAN. And we'll be stepping up that website and actually growing it. In one way, we're going to add new features this year, but we're also going to add new languages. So with our goal being to eventually be able to have local language versions of these skills-based programs for everyone across the region, but starting with 2 of the larger language pools in 2021. So it's the SME ASEAN SME Academy. So please look it up, and that is the way we're doing it. Obviously, there are lots of other ways we're helping education, including by providing notepads for students and education materials in digital form across the region. And Google, likes of Google and Apple and Microsoft, are stepping up in that regard. So thank you again, and I appreciate the last question.
Thank you. So now we have 2 minutes left. Dr. Lenterit, final comments, final remarks. Turn off, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you so much, John and Alex. Actually, I have not much to comment on yours, but I just would like to jump in a little bit on the Myanmar issue, where I think Cambodia can play an important role in solving the Myanmar crisis. Here, I find that now is the time. Perhaps Cambodian can play a role as the mediators. I don't know, maybe provide good offices for the relevant disputants within the Myanmar, say the military or the other factions. Because as I observe, I follow up with the news recently that the demonstrators is now seem to turn to collaborate with the other ethnic minorities, say Kachin or Karen. So, which is, more or less, it's Bori, the military junta. That's the point where we can jump in, where ASEAN as well as Cambodia can jump in to the issue by offer the good offices or the mediating role, because this is where the military, the conflict, if you want to solve it, we need to find the hurting stalemate in this point. So I think this is a good time where Cambodia can jump in. So I think maybe Cambodia, I don't know, I'm not at the ministry, so I think the Cambodia can offer the solution to the other ASEAN colleague, and perhaps we can suggest to our Myanmar friend whether we can, how can we engage in this issue, and I think this is an opportunity for Cambodia. Thank you.
I hope that is true. And I hope that you would tell your officials in Phnom Penh, would tell people in the Biden administration what you believe you could bring to the table and how you could be helped to facilitate such a mediation, if that's possible, because all avenues have to be tried. My last response about Myanmar, I realize, had a very pessimistic tone. I like to leave it on an optimistic tone. And it's about Cambodia, and it's about, we've been talking about education. For the last several years, I have mentored a young man who is Cambodian, who came to the United States under the Southeast Asia Young Leaders Program, which was started under the Obama administration, but it continued under the Trump administration as well. And this young man went to Northern Illinois University, where I did my graduate work. And he spent a month there. And NIU had a program that said, if you apply and you're accepted, and you were part of the CL program, we will pay your tuition full for 4 years. And he wound up going to getting the tuition-free scholarship. But then also he managed to somehow get funding for his room and board. He graduated from NIU as the Lincoln Laureate, which means he was the top undergraduate in the whole school, in the undergraduate school, of over 16,000 students. He was the first international student ever to be awarded it in NIU, and second in the whole state of Illinois. He's now finishing up his master's degree as a Heinz Fellow at the University of Pittsburgh in public policy. And he's just been accepted to do a PhD in international relations and Southeast Asian studies, and wants to do a specialization in the future of work at the University of Toronto. So he's going to go to Canada, but they offered him more money, and it's a good program. So, but I think this is an example of where you can have a public-private partnership, something that was started by a government program, but then coupled with other funding from other institutions to allow a person to be able to get this kind of education who wants to go back and to contribute to the betterment of political, economic, and social life of people in Cambodia. And so I'm proud to know him, and I'm happy he has done so well, and I believe he'll make a great contribution to your country when his education is finished.
Thank you very much. Allow me to take this opportunity once again to thank our distinguished panelists, Mr. John Brandon, Mr. Alexander Feldman from the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, and John Brandon from the Asia Foundation, and my colleagues, Dr. Lane Turet from AVI, for the wonderful and insightful contribution to our dialogue on U.S.-Southeast Asia relation today. And thank you all the audience and those who raised questions. Forgive us if we don't answer all the questions that you posted on our Facebook Live. Hope to see you next time, and stay healthy and safe from COVID-19. Thank you all. Have a nice day, a nice evening. Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye from Washington.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank